Install the keeper and remove the rod extension. Thread the retainer nut onto the rod until 10 mm of threads are uncovered. Remember that the nut is installed with the shoulder facing the spring. Thread on the fork cap, and while holding the retaining nut, torque the cap to specification. Remove the fork from the compression tool and install the fork in the holding tool to torque the cap. With the cartridge-style fork completed, we will now disassemble, clean, and reassemble the damper tube-style fork, the right fork leg. Clamp the right side fork into the holder and loosen the fork cap. Back the 14 mm retaining nut away from the fork cap. Remove the fork cap, retainer nut, and rubber stopper from the inner fork nut threaded shaft. To remove the inner fork nut, clamp the lower fork tube in a vise using a piece of wood to protect the outside surface. Using the inner fork nut remover installer tool, loosen and remove the inner fork nut assembly from the fork tube. Remove the fork from the vise and tip to drain the oil and remove the collar, washer, and spring. Note the sequence of these parts for assembly. Now, reinstall the fork holder in the vise to hold the fork tube horizontally. Use a wooden dowel to tap the chrome dust cover away from the seal. Remove the dust seal and the lock ring. To free the slider from the tube, gently slide hammer the slider against the tube. Remove the bushing, spacer, seal, lock ring, dust shield, and cover. Be careful not to damage the components and set the components aside. Thoroughly clean and inspect each component. Any parts that are bent, broken, or damaged should be replaced. Check the dust cover where it rubs on the fork tube. Always replace oil seals and O-rings with new ones. Place the protective cover found with the fork seal driver over the tube and then slide the chrome dust cover, dust cap, lock ring, and apply some fork oil to the new fork seal and install. Next, remove the cover and install the spacer and bushing on the fork slider. Lightly coat the slider and bushing with fork oil and gently slide the fork slider into the fork tube. Using the long end of the fork seal driver, drive the bushing and spacer into the fork tube until the driver is flush with the slider. Then drive a new fork seal into the tube with the driver. Install the lock ring over the fork seal. Then seat the dust seal into the fork slider. Now, reverse the driver and use the short side to install the chrome dust cover. Rotate the cover to match any burrs on the slider and tap the cover into place. Readjust the holder in the vise to hold the fork tube vertically. Fully compress the slider into the fork tube. Now, fill the fork with Harley-Davidson Type E fork oil until it's within 4 inches from the top of the fork. Set the Pro level gauge to 4.8 inches. Add or remove oil to achieve the correct level. With the tightly wound end at the bottom, install the spring followed by the washer and spring collar. Move the fork from the holder to the vise with the protective wooden block. Use the inner fork nut remover installer to install the inner fork nut assembly. You must push down while turning to start the nut. Tighten the inner fork nut assembly to specified torque. Install the rubber stopper followed by the retainer nut until 10 mm of thread are exposed on the threaded shaft. Thread on the fork cap. And while holding the retaining nut, torque the fork cap to specification. Finally, torque the fork cap to the fork tube. Insert the fork tubes, cartridge style on the left and the damper style on the right. Measure the depth of the recess from the top front of the triple clamp. Both sides must be exactly the same, 1.7 mm or 70 thousandths of an inch. With the tubes in exact position, knock out the wooden wedges in the clamps. The compression of the triple clamp should hold the forks in position. The pinch bolts will be installed later. Complete the basic reassembly of the front wheel, fender, and brake calipers. To equal the final weight of the front fork assembly, install the pinch bolts. However, before final tightening the pinch bolts, check the fall away of the front forks. Place a piece of masking tape on the front fender and position a pointer so the pointer indicates the center of the fender. Tap the tire on the side until the front end begins to fall away. Mark the point on the tape where the wheel started to fall away. Tap the tire on the opposite side until the front end begins to fall away. Mark the point on the tape where the wheel started to fall away. The distance between the marks must be within 2 to 4 inches. If it is more than 4 inches or less than 2 inches, the head bearing adjustment is out of specification. To adjust the bearings, the adjuster nut under the fork stem nut must be loosened or tightened until the measurement is within spec. This requires protecting or removing the airbox cover, the gauge cluster and covers, and removing the handlebar clamps and lifting off the handlebars and rider controls. Bend down the fork stem lock washer tabs and loosen the fork stem nut. If the fall away is more than 4 inches, loosen the adjusting nut under the fork stem nut. If the fall away is less than 2 inches, tighten the adjusting nut. Each time you measure a fall away, tighten the fork stem nut to specification and place the handlebars, instruments, and cover in rider position. If the adjustment seems to have no effect, the fork tubes could be binding in the triple clamps, preventing the upper clamp from moving. Strike the upper triple clamps with a dead blow hammer to free the forks. Continue the adjustment until fall away is within spec. Each time you need to turn the adjusting nut, the clamps will have to be loosened and the handlebars and rider controls set aside. Each time you measure a fall away, the fork stem nut will have to be torqued to final specification. The handlebars, controls, and instrument cluster will have to be installed. When fall away falls between the 2 and 4 inch range, bend the stem lock washer tabs into place and tighten the handlebar clamps to specification. Install the instrument cluster and cover. At this point, the fork caps can be reinstalled. Inside the angled recess in the triple clamp are notches. The spring clip for the fork caps fits inside these notches. Set the cap on top of the opening with the wide lip to the rear and gently press down while pushing the sides of the spring clip in until it drops into place. The service manual recommends that you use new pinch bolts. If you reuse the original pinch bolts, use a wire brush to loosen and clean off the old lock patch. In either case, you must chase the threads on the pinch bolt thread holes in the triple clamps with an M10 bottom tap and blow clean with compressed air to remove the lock patch debris. When reusing bolts, apply 2 drops of Loctite 262 to the first 1/4 inch of threads before installing. There is a specific tightening sequence for the pinch bolts. One side at a time. Tighten each set of bolts twice. Starting on one side, tighten the top pinch bolt in the upper triple clamp to spec, and then tighten the lower pinch bolt in the upper triple clamp to spec. Return to the top and retighten, and then retighten the bottom pinch bolt. Move to the bottom clamp on the same side and tighten the pinch bolts. Top bolt to spec, bottom bolt to spec, and then retighten the top bolt in the lower clamp to spec, and then retighten the bottom bolt to spec. Repeat the sequence for the top and bottom clamp on the opposite side. Always check fall away after final assembly. It might just be necessary to remove, loosen, and readjust it all over again. You can return the street rod to service by installing the negative battery cable, the airbox cover, and finally install the maxi fuse and right side cover. Test ride the street rod and check for fork action and brake operation. For technicians that have acquired maintenance and service skills for the VRSC A and B models, Servicing the new street rod will require few additional skills. However, the street rod does require careful attention to details of the radiator covers, the brake fluid lines, the instrument cover, and other details that will keep the street rods in shape. Attention to service intervals, procedures, and particularly the fork oil replacement requirements for the matched set of cartridge and damper style fork legs will contribute to the long-term performance of the street rod.